just like to find out a little bit about you. So, and your professional life. So, could you talk a little bit about,
Well,
what you did and how the book came about?
there was a job, a temporary job at the Historical Society, so that sounded interesting, and I took that. And before long, it turned into a permanent job and eventually into a career. And since I really loved history and knew something about this country anyway, since my family had come from here, I made it my life work.
Absolutely. And so what role did you play at the Historical Society?
Well, I started as a part-time research assistant, and that was good because it gave me a grounding in Minnesota history. I was working for a man who was doing a biography of Ignatius Donnelly, and I am interested in politics, always have been, was brought up a radical, and therefore Donnelly was very appealing to me, but he also, the work laid a foundation of early Minnesota history. And so from then I went on, I became editor of the journal Minnesota History for 8 years, edited books for a couple of years, and then decided to edit, a new department had been created. Times were a-changing everywhere, and certainly at the Historical Society. The preservation movement was in full swing. It was increasing in size rapidly. Historic sites were being acquired. They had never had any before the 1950s. Any historic sites like the Sibley House were owned by others. Perhaps they would consult the Historical Society, but it was not a matter of dictating the interpretation or restoration of it. And so that introduced a whole new and much larger operation. And it was a great time to be at an institution like that because there were many new kinds of jobs being offered, and I did a number of different things and still working for the same institution, which was very, very good.
Yeah. And you must still have been employed at the Historical Society when you began work on this book.
Well, I began work on this book and changed jobs within the Historical Society several times, but most of those jobs included some elements that sort of fed into the story of Henry Sibley, because Sibley's life is really the story of Minnesota from 1834 to 1890. And so it's, I learned a great deal that went into the background of the book, and that is, I think, very important, especially in today's world where the background that we live with is changing so much from what the world he knew that it's hard to make judgments of what kind of person he was, what his attitudes were. It takes a lot of study. Sibley was clearly, there was a need for a biography of Sibley, and the longer I worked at it, the more I realized that Sibley's story was the whole darn story of Minnesota. And unless you knew the background of it, and hey, that had been my job for 30 years. And I actually didn't finish it. The last chapters of it the last half of it basically was not finished until after I retired, because I always had something else to do. But it was that something else frequently fed, like the Red River Trails, fed right into the story of Sibley. So it was an interesting interplay there, and there was no way I wasn't going to finish that book.
Well, it's a very impressive accomplishment, and
well, as I say, I felt there was a real need for it, and that was before we had a lot of the to do with the Indians, modern to do, and I'm very sympathetic. I mean, the problem is, you know, you can't blame everything on one side, and for how many years we blamed everything on the Indians. Maybe it's their turn. But
So,
that still isn't history.
you did a lot of study, and subtitle of the book, I think, is reflective of what you're talking about, of the changing times. And could you talk a little bit about how you came up with that subtitle and what it was?
Well, Sibley was a friend of the Indian in a certain sense. Today, in today's world, he's considered a perpetrator of genocide. So, which is not entirely fair, but he did sentence 300 Indians to be hanged after the Dakota War. Most of them were pardoned by Lincoln, but it's as I say, very hard to make judgments on a world we didn't know, and so it's.
He struggled with it, obviously, himself, and so
he is in the unique position of having been vilified by his political enemies in the 1860s for not having been hard enough on the Indians, not having killed every Indian he saw. But by today's world, he is being vilified because he killed so many Indians. Or he actually didn't. He sentenced them to death, and fortunately, they were pardoned by somebody with more distance on the subject and more humanity.
if you could refer to the subtitle of your book and tell me just a little bit more.
Divided Heart refers to the fact also that he did have an Indian woman. He had fathered a child by an Indian woman, though he, in the particular passage you're referring to, he is telling a story of how he refused the offers of her father to supply him with a bedmate. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he either would have had to change the story to conform with the truth, or he would have had to outright lie. And this is characteristic, very characteristic, I would say, of after having read as much as I have of his life and his writings. He was a divided heart. I mean, he didn't want to admit to being the father of an Indian child, but half the state knew about it anyway. So, but he didn't know how to include it in his writing and how to approach the subject, because it was contrary to his own beliefs and standards. And I'm sure he was thinking too in terms of it would embarrass his white children and his white family and wife and so on.
Where was he born? What kind of a family did he have?
Well, he was a symbol of the caption that New England moves west. I mean, he was the son of the offspring of an elite New England family. His father was a lawyer, became a congressman and a judge in Michigan Territory. Sibley was born in Detroit. His mother also was from a distinguished New England family. One of the early settlers who had moved to Marietta, Ohio, the first New England settlement in the old Northwest Territory. So Sibley had impeccable credentials as a New England intellectual and righteous leader. And it's unclear, and it was always unclear on the frontier in what denomination people were brought up. He was sent to school with an Episcopalian minister. But later he became a Presbyterian because they were the only Christian denomination in the territory. So it's a little hard to say he was this or that. He himself claimed that he was not a denominationalist. He preferred to read the scriptures himself and make his own interpretation. But the Holy Scriptures were very important to him. And he ended up life being an Episcopalian. Detroit was on the edge of the frontier. It had come into American possession only 2 years before Sibley's father moved there. It was attacked again by the British in the War of 1812, and the Sibley family had to flee as refugees to Marietta and live with his mother's parents when Henry Sibley was only a year old. So he was a frontiersman, but not in the sense of, say, Daniel Boone was. Mm-hmm. And Detroit was very much an intercultural, bilingual community. Henry grew up speaking fluent French. That was the language of the kids on the street, and to the extent there were any streets. But Detroit was a key to the fur trade. It was the funnel through which the fur trade fed down the St. Lawrence River through Montreal. It had been the French fur trade, and it was established by the French. The customs of the trade and a great many of the ties with Indian people were established by the French. The English took it over during the 7 Years' War. That's what it's called in Europe. Here it's called the French and Indian War. And it became very much an international city. So I think that's an important factor to remember in his adjusting to Minnesota, because Minnesota was an outlier district of Detroit at that time.
You mentioned it was a center for the fur trade, and Henry actually got his kind of start in his professional life in that
Well,
profession.
his father had wanted him to join him in the law, but Henry loved the out of doors, loved hunting, fishing, camping out, and adventure. And he finally told his father, he was a dutiful son, but he told his father, no way. His older brother had gone to West Point and had led his class at West Point and became an Army officer the rest of his life. Even that would probably not have satisfied Henry. And he was offered a job at Sault Ste. Marie in the fur trade, and he wanted to accept it, and as he says, his parents wisely let him follow his own inclinations. And so at the age of 17, which seems very young to us, but in those days was not considered quite so young, he left Detroit for Sault Ste. Marie, was there for a year, a little over a year, and then got a promotion because he was a capable young man, and went to Mackinac, which was at that point a subsidiary headquarters for the American Fur Company. And in some ways it was the working headquarters. It's where the furs came in. Brigades of voyageurs came up from Montreal with goods and new employees and so on. And Indians came in with their catch of furs, or more likely, as years passed, decades passed, subsidiary traders who were trading out at Mendota, at La Pointe on Lake Superior, and at Prairie du Chien, at various other places around the western country. They would collect the furs, and then they would bring them in to Mackinac. And this introduced another middleman in the trade, But it was necessary because the volume of it was growing.
It gave Henry a new opportunity.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could set the scene a little bit. What kind of a world did he find himself in?
Well, it was an Indian world, Indian land. It was dominated by the United States after the War of 1812 and 1817, and in the 1820s when a ring of forts was built by the main promoter of that was the Secretary of Defense, or War at that time, John C. Calhoun, and hence the name Lake Calhoun, which we are debating now. But it was Indian country. It was divided between the Ojibwe and the Dakota, who sometimes got along and often didn't. And the tradition that they were eternal enemies is exaggerated entirely. There were some bands that got along better with the other tribe than others did. Some of the famous chiefs were descended from both tribes. Wabasha was one. And so it was not a situation of eternal warfare out here, but there were skirmishes. And Fort Snelling was the center of American power, and there was a first post. Of course, with the war and the changeover, a rather complicated transfer of business interests that occurred between the Northwest Fur Company and the American Fur Company. Northwest was Canadian. It was in competition with the Hudson Bay Company, which was English. So the popular belief that, the competitors for the American fur were Hudson Bay people is not true at all. There were no Hudson Bay Company posts in Minnesota that we know of. There may have been a wintering camp now and then, or a stray trader who came down and collected some furs illegally, but that was the extent of it. There was no major Hudson Bay Company presence in Minnesota. It was all north of the established boundary, but wherever that was, nobody knew exactly, but somewhere up there in the woods. And that all came later, and that was part of Henry Sibley's career and life, the establishment of trade with the Selkirk settlement, which was founded up where Winnipeg now is, and various other developments in Canada. Our history is as much Canadian history in the early years as it is United States history.
When did Sibley arrive in Minnesota?
1834.
And what was, it wasn't called Minnesota then.
It was the upper Mississippi country. It really was not. It was part of the Northwest Territory up to the Mississippi River. Of course, it was two separate territories. It was Louisiana Territory on the west of the river and Northwest Territory on the east. So, but nobody paid much attention, except we still see that preserved in our names. That's why West St. Paul is south of the Minnesota, of the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
It was an important boundary at that time, and then gradually, as the country was organized, states were carved out of the Northwest Territory. The last two carved were Iowa and Wisconsin, and there was a little sliver of Minnesota left. And some of the politics surrounding what became of that little sliver is covered in your interview on Joseph Brown. Mm-hmm. He played an important political role there.
When he first arrived at, I think it was maybe called New Hope originally, what, you know, aside from the Dakota and Ojibwe, what about the population of white people in
Well,
this area
there were
at that time?
the army was it. There were very few white settlers. They were illegal. If the Indians had given them permission to stay, sometimes they did, but there were very few of them. And most of the ones that were considered white were mixed blood. They had family ties to one another of the Indian tribes. But the other element of population that in very recent years we have found definitely lived here were black slaves. The Army brought slaves here. Each officer was allowed received a monetary allowance for a servant. And many of them were slave owners, so they simply brought their slaves and collected the allowance, added it to their pay, which was not illegal, but it was and probably helped some Army officers who didn't receive very high pay. But there were many more black slaves here than just Dred Scott, who made the news and made the history books. There wasn't a great number. They were all personal servants. They weren't field hands or anything like that. But they were definitely an element in the population. And at one point, Henry Sibley had a black working for him who was a slave borrowed from someone else, probably Hercules Dousman, his partner down at Prairie du Chien, where there were even more black people.
Mm-hmm. There wasn't much in the way of settlements. People hadn't started.
The only settlement was what came down from Canada, from the Selkirk settlement, and that's a whole story in itself. They weren't numerically very important, but they certainly were important in terms of helping establish the culture here. Most of them moved farther south than Minnesota, down to Iowa or Illinois and Indiana, but the Selkirk settlement established what later became a major fur trade route, the Red River Trails. And I was fortunate in my career being assigned to do research on the Red River Trails. The legislators from the Red River Valley had said, hey, we need our history told. And the Historical Society said, yes, sir. Mm-hmm. And I got assigned to do that. Well, that fed right into the story of Henry Sibley.
Could you talk about his responsibilities, his area for the fur trade?
And it was definitely the Dakota tribe. It was not, the fur trade was not divided by boundaries of areas. To some extent it was, because certain Indian tribes occupied those and used them. But it was really divided. The Western outfit served the Dakota and the Winnebago and a few others. Sibley was responsible solely for the Dakota. In the later years, that became very mixed up because the Indians themselves, the old fur trade was opened to many small independent traders who traded with anybody they wanted to. And it became much more diffuse at that time. And Sibley was part of that. But the Western outfit of which brought him here to Minnesota and his earlier years here were strictly the Dakota. And I'm not aware that he spoke any Indian language other than Dakota. I believe he did speak. How fluent he was in it, it's hard to say. Probably for practical purposes, fairly fluent, but he certainly lived with them a lot and talked with them a lot. So,
where was his headquarters, and how did that relate to where he lived?
His headquarters was at Mendota, directly across the river from Port Snelling. But that had been a fur trade rendezvous for many years before Fort Snelling was built even. May have been one reason the site was selected for it. But Sibley then administered a whole string of posts up the Minnesota River and some down the Mississippi River and scattered out across the country, but not a great number of posts, maybe a dozen or so at the most. And the farthest north, I think, was Lake Traverse, out on the what is now the South Dakota border. Mm-hmm. There, the Dakota band of Sisseton were located in that area, and or part of them were, and that had always been a profitable location for the company.
How did it work? How did the furs come to be there?
Well,
it was the place where people brought furs, but who brought them there? And
well, the Indians themselves brought them, bands, family groups or bands, small bands of Indians. However, they divided themselves up or sorted themselves out, but all one tribe pretty much, and they would come in. And especially toward the end of the fur trade, which again is what we're talking about with Henry Sibley, many of them would come in pretty hungry because game was disappearing. The buffalo had moved west farther. It was caribou, herds of caribou, and the white-tailed deer was replacing the caribou, which had been an Indian staple. And they couldn't afford to buy ammunition for and new guns. If the guns were broken or worn out, they couldn't afford to buy new ones. They certainly could not afford a constant supply of ammunition. So they got it on credit from the trader. And then when they came back in the spring with their load of furs, that was how they paid for it and got a new supply. So in some ways, they were they would not have considered themselves employees. They were trading the furs they caught, but they were nevertheless under this system of constant debt creation were tied to the one post and to the one trader. And the Indians, generally speaking, were very honorable about observing those ties. Of course, in later years, even later than the end of Sibley's career, they had many more options. They got corrupted by white traders who said, hey, we'll pay you more, and don't bother about how's he going to collect it, his debts, and so on. And whiskey, that was the point at which whiskey became important in the trade. Before that, the bigger fur companies in the earlier years of fur trade avoided trading liquor because it interfered with the operations of the fur trade. And it was only later that they allowed it at all. It was often used as a gift, but never as a trade item in the early years. In the later years, all bets were off.
Mm-hmm. Another, really important thing that was going on were various treaties with the Indians, and I think the first one that Henry Sibley was involved in was in 1837.
Yes, that's right. He was not directly involved in negotiating it, but he was present, and it had enormous effects on his business because that gave all of the land east of the Mississippi River, what had been Old Northwest Territory, became, I think, first Michigan, then for a brief time, then Wisconsin Territory. And Wisconsin Territory was what he was dealing with most of the time.
And what was the purpose of the treaties?
To allow settlers to buy land. And that's, it was part of the westward push. Most treaties were, that was the ultimate purpose of them. And in Minnesota it had many effects, like bringing the frontier, the white settlement, much closer to Fort Snelling, right across the river, and making the Falls of St. Anthony a prime plum for investment. And there was a whole story about who got that. But Sibley didn't get that, but he married the owner, the sister of the owner. So
He did have a real affinity, developed with Dakota, and in fact, I was really fascinated about his alter ego, if you will, Hal Dakota.
well, Hal Dakota was a pen name. And he did write a number of articles about hunting in the Wild West. And they were quite popular and certainly fed his ego. And probably didn't make him much of any money, but it was, they became fairly well known. And they reveal, most of them are not all that interesting to us today, but they reveal a little bit of what his attitudes were as a white man. He posed as the great white hunter. Now, I doubt that he actually behaved that way when he was with the Indians. I mean, I'm sure he, again, like his description of the white trader as being the source to which the Indians went for leadership. I think that's ridiculous, quite frankly. But again, this was the attitude of the white man's superiority, or at least the superiority of his culture. And so.
But he did those, on he wrote about, the hunting expeditions and so on. He actually, did that, and in fact,
he did.
For
yes.
some extended
yes.
periods,
mm-hmm.
sometimes. And could you talk a little bit about that, as how it may have influenced his interactions with the native population in the future?
The longest period was in 1841 when he had been he'd been ill for a while, and I've forgotten some common disease that then was very serious. Now we would dismiss it, but it's and he had been trying to get out of the fur trade and get back to Detroit and settle into a tamer business. But his friend, and they were good personal friends as well as business partners, Hercules Dousman of Prairie du Chien, and advised him to go out with the Indians for a while and take some time to hunt. And Dousman knew that Sibley loved hunting, and so he did go out with a group of Indians who were venturing down into what was then Winnebago territory. It wasn't the native Winnebago territory, it's what they'd been given. But they were asserting their right to it, and there was some dusting up between the Dakota hunters and Winnebago, and it was, they thought they'd be safer with a white man with them. And so Sibley went with them for about, I think he was 2 or 3 months. And when he came back, he was a prospective father, and he was also a very, very satisfied hunter, and had quite a few tales to tell of the adventure on the frontier. So
And that was
the longest he stayed with them. He did go out for brief hunts, a week or so maybe, but he didn't live with the Indians except for that one period.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned that that was 1840, and it was a prospective father, and it's also followed fast with
well, there was already in the works an effort to get a treaty, and the Dakota bands had allegedly agreed to it. We don't have much paperwork on that. It was all handled pretty informally, but the treaty would have, they tried to get it, the written copy of it is what they tried to get through Congress, which would have created an Indian territory, much like was initially thought to be the case with Oklahoma, that it would be owned and entirely owned, not open to white settlement. It would be entirely owned and governed by the Indians, and as they became educated, in the white man's schools, of course, they would be capable of governing themselves, and really, in some ways, they'd be part of this country, but also a separate state. And to the extent that states have their own states' rights, this would have them. Congress turned down that, as it had several other proposals, similar proposals, and as it eventually did with Oklahoma too. And the greed of the white man for land was just more than the Indians had the power to withstand.
You'd also written about that, that it was setting up a separate state was seen as a threat, that it would admit racial and cultural pluralism to government.
Well, yeah, and it would allow the Indians to keep their own culture within their own state if they governed it. And of course, the assumption was that they would soon, after a few generations, adopt the superior white culture anyway. They might have, because it was more powerful, not because it was a better culture, but because it was more powerful. Who knows? They never were given the chance, like the Cherokee. The Cherokee did everything right, but they were moved.
It seems to play into a little bit
racism and disdain for indigenous cultures. It's all part of the same picture. But the white European wasn't the only one that ever engaged in that. It's a human failing.
On one hand, Sibley was, promoting and in favor of the Indians having some self-determination, and on the other hand,
well, I think at that specific time in 1841, and he stayed in the East for a number of months lobbying Congress for the treaty. At that particular time, they would have created first a territory and then a state. And the territory would have been an Indian territory. But the president would have had, as with all territories, the appointment of the governor and the executive officers. I don't know about the legislature, what the specific provisions for that were. But Henry had his eye on the governor's office, and he was very likely to have, if the treaty had gone through, he was very likely to have gotten it, because he was the outstanding candidate in Minnesota. He knew the territory, he was trusted by most people in it, both Indian and white. As a businessman, he was trustworthy, and he was better educated than most of them, and so on and so on. He was also a fairly astute politician.
He had a child. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, so little is known, really, and again, there has been for many years the assumption among historians that Sibley deliberately concealed the birth of Helen. That was what he named her for himself, Helen Hastings Sibley. If he'd been trying to conceal her, that was not the thing to do. And her mother died not too long after the birth of the child, 3 or 4 years, I think, but we don't know. And we don't really know what the mother's name was, even. And we're not certain which branch of the Dakota, whether it was the Wapakuti or the Mdewakanton that she belonged to. But it's possible she had a parent from both. But in any case, very little is known about her until she is placed with a white a family. They were not missionaries, but they worked for a mission, and they were mission farmers. And then they eventually moved to St. Paul with the child. She went to St. Paul Public Schools then. Or they probably didn't have public schools at that point, but she went to school with other white children. And she married a doctor from a white man who was boarding with the family, and he was from a little south of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And Sibley was, supportive of her.
He supported her. He gave her gifts. We have hidden in obscure places in some of his notebooks are little notes that suggest these things, but they don't really give you much information. And so that, as I say, the tradition grew up that he had tried to hide her existence, which there is one mention of her in the St. Paul newspaper. She was part of a parade that they had, and her father, the governor, rode behind her. The newspaper, of course, it was a Republican paper, and they didn't like Sibley. But there was in the newspaper. I mean, everybody knew it, and or everybody who cared. Mm-hmm. And but she died then, and she didn't actually die in childbirth, but she died 2 or 3 days after her first baby was born. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it was easy for people to forget she'd ever lived. And she died out of state, out of the area. And but we have a few letters, 1 or 2 letters, written to her father. Somehow they escaped the Holocaust of a family and personal correspondence. And she writes, I mean, she was a well-educated young woman.
The status and the presence of the mixed bloods, as they were called, had played. Are those the same?
Métis are French Indian mix in Canada. I mean, that's where the term is mainly used. Here it's used more loosely, but in Canada it's definitely French Indian. And the British Indian mixed bloods tended to be called mixed bloods. English term, Métis, of course, is a French word. So it makes, I mean, there's no particular meaning to it. It just makes sense that they use their own language.
But they were a significant component of the overall population.
Here, yes. Yeah, I've been in most of the French-Canadian voyageurs did, not very many of the French Canadians were pure French Canadian. Many of them were mixed blood, and it's impossible at this point to determine what proportion. But there were a few that were outstanding. I think Jean-Baptiste Fairbolt is known because he was pure French, and he was kind of an exception in that respect. And he may not have been as much of an exception as they said. It's hard to tell. Mm-hmm. We didn't have DNA testing then. It might have revealed some interesting things.
So, did Sibley have to go to Washington again? How did Minnesota become a territory again?
Well, yes, Sibley, he went to Washington on his own penny, his own nickel, and lobbied for it. And he had good friends in Washington. Stephen Douglas was one, and of course Douglas was not by that time still very important, but he had friends, and Lewis Cass was another. And it was he succeeded in getting Minnesota made into a territory, just the little slice of Minnesota that was between the St. Croix and the Mississippi, which again, the story goes back a long ways. It's a lot deeper than just individuals lobbying for this or that, because the upper Midwest, Iowa, Wisconsin, even Michigan to some extent, had their eyes on this spot, which was where three rivers met from east, west, and north, and where the head of navigation, you couldn't get a steamboat in those days beyond St. Paul, and where this terrific waterfall was, which promised power for all sorts of mills and machines. And obviously was going to be the most important part of any state that was formed. So Iowa had its eyes on it, but they were cut out of fairly early when they became a state. And then Wisconsin made a stronger pitch, and there was a bill that put the boundary at the Mississippi River, not the St. Croix where it is today. And that got defeated. But again, these were bigger forces than Henry Sibley. He was working around the edges, but he was not that powerful until they got a bill in to create a territory of Minnesota, and then he went and pulled all the I've forgotten what word I want.
Pulled out
all the stops in his lobbying, and got it. I think there was more to the story than that. I should review that. They may have created a territory in name only, and he was sent as representative, but I don't believe so.
Well, they had to move pretty much right away. Could white people start moving into the territory right away, or was there some other step required?
No, there were already, of course, there was St. Paul, and you mentioned that it was largely a French fur trade town. And of course, when the government started to survey it, then people were, especially the French Canadians, were afraid that their land claims would not be honored. And Sibley, as a fairly skilled, by that time he had become a lawyer. Necessity forced him to. I don't think he actually got his papers as a lawyer until the 1840s, but he was operating as a lawyer, and obviously knew the language and the rules, and that was what mattered. So yes, he created a political stronghold in St. Paul that way. And of course, a lot of them had been his employees at one time or another. There's a lot more to say about Sibley during the territorial years, but the first couple of years, maybe it's more than two, I don't know what the term of a congressional representative was, probably 2 years. The first half of the 1840s, he was occupied in Washington and traveling back and forth, which was a chore in itself. And then the second half was getting, he presided at the Constitutional Convention, which again says something about how Sibley was regarded. He was not nonpartisan by any means. He was Democrat, but he was trusted. And a lot of Republicans knew him in a business way and trusted him, and therefore, okay, we'll let him. And he presided at the convention, but he also took part in the debates, and that was one thing I had to chase up and find out where this man really did stand about some things. It was kind of interesting. I mean, they were not major things, but details, and he played an active role in getting us our Constitution up and running. He became the congressional representative, which is has no vote. A territory has no vote. But that was after it became a territory, after the president had appointed the executive officers. And Sibley was elected the territorial representative. He served, I think, 2 terms as that, and then quit. I turned it over to Henry Rice. Henry Rice was chomping at the bit to get into that. Henry Rice was a very different type of politician from Sibley, but he also did some good things for the state.
We'll get to Rice County at some point and do that story.
I don't know much about that story.
But pretty much right away, the big thing was another treaty.
Mm-hmm. Well, the big thing now, here was this town of St. Paul, which was the capital of a territory, sitting right beside Indian land, across the river from Indian land. And the whites were already poaching on Indian land, but it was illegal and recognized as such. But that was the pressure to sign a treaty, and the new governor of the territory, Alexander Ramsey, was very aware that his political career depended on that. And he was hoping to get it ASAP, and he and Sibley cooperated because it was to both men's eternal interest to cooperate and get this treaty signed. And Sibley was trusted by the Dakota. He'd worked with them for close to 20 years, and he was in a position to block a treaty. He wasn't necessarily in the position to automatically get them to sign one, but he certainly could have blocked one. And Ramsey realized they were Whig. Ramsey was a Whig, Sibley was a Democrat, but they realized they had to work together, and they did. Though, the old lore that they were good friends. On one level they were good friends. On another, there are some pretty crisp letters between the two men, because Sibley at one point got pretty ticked with Ramsey over the treaty, and Ramsey was pushing too hard, and Sibley said, "Don't push this. Just leave it to me, and I'll get it in due time." But
so, what year was it that they did it? And
I think that was 1850. And the next year, 1851, they again, they staged it staged the treaty council at a time when most of the Indians, the western band of Indians, could attend. And of course, that was a very interesting political ploy, because they dealt separately with the 4 different bands of the Dakota. And the ones who were in the position to make the best bargain for the tribe were the Metawakanton, who were right across the river and knew the white men and had some pretty aggressive leadership with Little Crow and other chiefs of that band. And the upper bands, the Sisseton and Wahpeton, were from farther out up the Minnesota River. And for one thing, the game had been very low in their territory, in their country, and they had been pretty hungry for several years out there. And it was a prime time to urge them to make a treaty and get the treaty money for their land and treaty goods and so on, just to feed their people. That is not often emphasized in the discussions of the treaties, but it was certainly, it was a factor. You know, other ploys that were used to get them to come in and sign, many as there were different people. But like all Indian treaties, the actual terms of the treaty were pretty much neglected by the U.S. government, and the treaties themselves. I mean, what was that land worth? Well, you talk to it about in today's dollars or in 1851 dollars, it's very different, and it's very hard to compare eras of history, and it was unfair. There was the power balances on the two sides were clearly unfair.
And then, what role did the traders have in that, or the trading business?
Well, the traders' paper, there had already been a lot of reaction in the East among missionary types and among, quote, friends of the Indian, and so some among missionaries here in Minnesota, the Pond brothers. You have some letters that really protesting the way the Indians were being manipulated and treated. And Sibley, assuring them he was doing all he could as territorial representative to prevent this, but he couldn't do much. And so you get both sides of a story there. And
was there a financial incentive to the traders?
Sibley was owed a lot of money, and again, that gets very complicated because where the debts, because this was considered not a business corporation like we have today, which when it goes broke, its debts are canceled. The companies, the debts of one trader who went broke were carried on to the next trader who took over his trade. And so that was where the pile of debts came from. But isn't all of it by any means. And as I say in my book, the traders had very little choice but to feed the Indians when they came in hungry, because if they wanted any furs next year, they'd better do it. And so it was a complicated story. But the debts were owed by the Indians to the traders like Martin McLeod at Locky Parle or at Traverse des Sioux, and others, I forgot who was at Locky Parle at that time. They switched around a bit, and other traders scattered around Sibley's territory. Oh, and the debts that were owed to Sibley were owed by those traders, not by the Indians themselves. So his name never appears on the traders' paper. But it was fully understood that if, they worked together. If he supported the small traders and they got paid off, then they'd pay their share off to him. And he, in turn, was indebted to the American Fur Company. And it went clear back to even, the American Fur Company had failed in 1842. And in today's world, all that would have been water under the bridge. But in those days, it wasn't. Those debts were still owed. And that's where the money went, mainly. First to the Shoto Company in St. Louis, and then to some of it to the American Fur Company.
Where was that first 1851 treaty, and which bands, and then
it was the two bands at Traverse des Sioux, and then immediately they took a boat down to Mendota and signed with the two lower bands, Wapakuti, which were very small by that time, and Mdewakanton, which were powerful.
And why did they have the two different treaties?
Well, the upper bands could not get down easily to Fort Snelling, and there was no place for them to camp there. That was Mdewakanton territory. And I suppose it could have been arranged, but it was much easier for the white man to move up to Traverse des Sioux. And I don't think it necessarily had anything to do with the fact that Sibley had a lot of property interests at Traverse des Sioux, because the treaty itself didn't affect those particularly. But it was a convenient place to hold the treaty, and easy to get supplies to by boat on the river. And Mendota was here. They started holding it in I think a tent or one of the fur trade buildings in Mendota. It was just too hot. They all were melting, so they moved up to Pilot Knob, and or at least one of the higher promontories up there. Whether it was the top of the knob, probably not. But they then put up a tent up there where they could get some breeze and finish the treaty up there.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned, there was right after the
there were a lot of complications with the Mendota Treaty, because the Mdewakanton, again, they were a little more savvy than the Western bands, and they had not been fully paid for the 1837 treaty. And they said, look here, first we get this in cash, and we mean cash, I mean silver dollars. Mm-hmm. And so Sibley scrambled around to find the cash, and the Chateau Company lent them some, lent the government some, and it was, and he also scrambled around to get horses, because the Indians, if they had cash, they'd buy horses.
What did the Dakota get out of the deal?
They got the reservation on both sides of the Minnesota River, which later in 1858 was cut down to one side, because if they were all farming, they didn't need more land than that, it was argued. And because they weren't all farming, and many of them were hunting on the other side of the river, white settlers were coming in, and more dust-ups were occurring between white settlers and the Indian hunters. And that was considered an undesirable situation. So the 1858 treaty, which was a real steal, the value of the land, I have forgotten the figures. The land was valued at a great deal more. And Joseph Brown was one of those who fought to get the Indians the true value of the land. And where Brown was, you could bet Sibley was too. I mean, they worked together very closely. And it was, there's no question that the 1858 treaty was a real steal for the white man. But there were those who opposed it, and again, like the Indians who opposed it, they all got blamed.
You had mentioned something about why we had a treaty of 1858 and the farming. And could you talk a little bit from Sibley's perspective? I think he had a term referring to how his ideal of how the natives might be integrated into the white society.
How the Indians might be integrated.
Or the farmer versus the.
I think the general idea was that if you could make farmers out of them, then they'd be all right. They would be white and they'd be making a good living. Well, they were trying to make Indians into an agricultural society at the very time the United States was becoming an industrial society. And it wouldn't have worked in any case, even with, there were a lot of good intentions. Of course, we know where good intentions lead. But I don't mean to excuse the crass breaking of treaties, but it was not a thing that was going. Our own society was on the verge of collapse too, but we didn't recognize it then. We thought we were going on, digging up the earth forever, and it didn't work out that way. I'm like you. I am a strong environmentalist, and I mean, I was. If I'd been younger and more spry, I'd have been out there at Standing Rock.
Cool. We got up to, coinciding really with the new treaty was a new status for Minnesota in 1858.
Yeah, well, yes, it turned it over to the white man, and of course it was unsurveyed and it couldn't be bought. But the laws at the time, the land laws at the time, passed in the 1840s, allowed settlers to stake a claim and then not have to pay up the claim until the land was opened for sale. And opened for sale meant usually a public auction. And the settlers lived in terror of having their farms auctioned, put up for public auction. And you can understand, and most of them didn't have any money to pay for them anyhow. So finally they got a homestead law passed, which just gave them the land. And but the homestead law was not passed until the middle of the Civil War, the Lincoln administration. And by then Minnesota was pretty much past the frontier. Or at least, except for the timber up north, and the homestead law facilitated a lot of easy dipping on the timber, but that's a whole other story.
What about the transition for Minnesota from territory to state? What were kind of the factors behind that, and what role did Sibley play in that transition?
Well, I think, again, this is one of the stories my book covers, that really hadn't been covered much before, and that was his role as a whistleblower on the railroad. The deal that they cut to build a railroad to Duluth, and I'm trying to remember the details of that one. I think that one has sort of slipped past my memory. But it delayed the building of railroads in the state for nearly 10 years because the Civil War intervened. And it was during the territorial years that, as I say, Sibley blew the whistle. They thought they could get it, as they had with a Louisiana politician. They had gotten it through there. We're talking about the Illinois Central Railroad and and the people behind it. But Sibley was just a different kind of guy, and this is one reason he was a divided heart. He was all for business and enterprise, but you mean you're going to do that? No way. And it was. The whole story is there in the book, and it's also in the. I wrote an article in the territorial issue of Minnesota History, the anniversary of the territory, and it was back in the mid-1990s sometime.
Mm-hmm. Ancient history.
Yeah.
But how, from a political maneuvering standpoint, how did the transition happen from territory to state? Did Sibley have to go back to Washington, or what were the politics there? And
no, there wasn't really much opposition until it came to actually admitting the state as a state. And then the approach of the Civil War intervened, and the war in Kansas. Kansas was a territory seeking admission as a state at the same time Minnesota was. And of course, in those years, they were balancing off one slave state, one free state, so they could keep Congress balanced. And the war broke out in Kansas. I mean, there's nothing to call it but war. And until that got settled, Minnesota was just put on the shelf. So from Minnesota held its constitutional convention and provided for the election of state officers in the summer of 1857. Well, number one, there was a major crash then, business crash. 1857 was the great collapse of 1857 was legendary in the 19th century. And that held up things for a while, and then the battle over Kansas. No way Congress was going to admit Minnesota as a free state until they decided whether Kansas would be free or a slave. And they finally admitted Kansas as a slave state, and then they could admit Minnesota as a free state. There was never any question that Minnesota would be a slave state. I mean, it was a free state, but that's all it wanted to be. But it was delayed for 8 months, I think. Meantime, the Sibley was elected governor in the fall, and it was May before he was. The state was admitted, so he didn't really become governor. And they had a legislature elected, which legally really had no standing because it was elected by the territory's voters, and that was not meaningless. I mean, the territory between the Red River and the Missouri River, which was cut off when it became a state, included the settlement of Pembina, which was a large Métis settlement. Could vote in the U.S. elections, and was, I think they had several hundred votes from there, and not one single Republican vote. And conclude what you want to, but that's what elected Sibley governor. He was a Democrat, and already the North was turning Republican, and Lincoln swept Minnesota the next year. But in 2 years later, but in 1858, or 57, when they held the election, he was elected easily. 2 years later, Lincoln swept the state. So that was the chief complication, and it arises because, do you consider Henry Rice a senator from the territory or from the state? I mean, he served 2 terms, and he was a Democrat.
So you had mentioned railroads a minute ago, and did they play a
The railroads at that point in Minnesota didn't have a whole lot of, it was after the Civil War closed, then they really charged in. But at that point, there really wasn't much railroad building in Minnesota.
How did Sibley
he stopped
play into
the
the
railroad that had been projected between someplace down in Iowa, which connected with the Rock Island Railroad down from the east across the Mississippi River, and then came up the west bank of the Mississippi River through to St. Paul, and then on up to Duluth. But it didn't actually send on up to Duluth. I mean, there was no railroad at that time. It was all on paper. But it was a connection, a rail connection to the east.
It seems like there were bonds issued to pay for it, and that seemed to be a factor in Sibley's
I can't
life.
remember the details. There was the bill itself was altered after it was passed, which is clearly illegal.
So
and Sibley was alerted to this by a senator from Illinois, Elihu Washburn.
Okay.
The name Washburn should light a lot.
Exactly, it just did. Sibley, what were the years that Sibley was governor? He
was only governor for a little over 1 year because of the delay. It was just a 2-year term, and he was 8 months late in being inaugurated, and mainly just getting the government set up was his main accomplishment, and then the stand he took on what was the town, Monticello? Out there was a pre-Civil War. So I've forgotten again the details of that, but he took a very good stand in terms of the state government would not allow hanky-panky on the part of the local government. The sheriff was, and the story is in my book.
Yeah.
I can't recall it.
Well, it wasn't very long after he was had finished his term as governor that there was some major trouble in Minnesota.
Well, there was first there was the Democratic conventions of 1860 in the South, and Sibley was a delegate from Minnesota to that, and Minnesota was by then a state, so it was an important role, and he was a strong supporter of Stephen Douglas. He was a close friend of Douglas, and of course Lincoln was a Republican, but Lincoln carried the state, and Sibley had ended his term as governor, and he retired at that point. He lived in Mendota, and he liked it there, and he retired, and you know, he was presiding at the state fair, the first state fair that was held, and so on, and all the things that the elder statesmen do. And then the whole thing blew up with the Dakota uprising.
Just in the logistics and the actions that Sibley was involved in.
Sibley, the state was in a very bad position to handle an Indian war at that point. And that is precisely what the Indians were smart enough to see. I mean, they were in touch with what was going on in the South, and they figured if they were ever going to get their land back, that was the way to do it. And the chief elements that wanted to were the traditional medicine men, they were called then, traditional sacred leaders, and the young warriors, whose position of privilege within the tribe was definitely threatened, both groups. And if you changed the Indian culture, they weren't that important anymore. And they were strong in the Mdewakanton. They felt more sense of injury from the treaties than the other tribes, the other bands did. And they had the 1858 treaty particularly, and Little Crow had agreed to it, and by agreeing to war, he sort of erased that blot on his record. Or, I mean, he thought, as far as the tribe was concerned. And they wanted to get the white settlers out of what they considered their land. And in the first day or two, without warning, no warning at all, they killed at least 500. Probably a few more, but we don't know exactly. We don't know how many people were out there. We're talking white people. The vast majority of them were women and children. And they were completely taken by surprise, unexpected. And the enormous anger and bitterness and sense of injury that followed that, I mean, what would we feel today? It's and Sibley, there's a quotation from him in my book when he wrote, you know, I can't remember it exactly, but they've gone beyond all forgiveness.
Yes.
And these were people he knew and loved.
What was Sibley's role in the, response to the Indian
Well, Ramsey, and again, it's all in the book. Ramsey didn't have anyone really to call on. All the able-bodied men in the state were being rounded up and sent to the Union Army, and there was a draft by that time. This was 1862, and they had just introduced the draft. And he wrote to the Secretary of War, you know, we can't get any guys, and Lincoln wrote back, if there's no recruitment, there won't be any. If you can't recruit anybody, there won't be anybody recruited, period. And take care of the Indians. So Ramsey, meanwhile, had gone to Sibley, who was the person who knew the Indians the best. And there weren't any real military men around who knew anything about the Dakota or the country. And Sibley had never been a military man, but his brother, as I said, was an army, not a general, but an officer. And he lived with the army right across the river for most of his adult life. And he knew army ways very definitely. So he said yes, he'd lead as a civilian volunteer. He'd lead how could he say no? And he didn't want to particularly, but he did. And they rounded up as many as they could, and they found at some point they found they had no rifles or muskets, no guns, and sent back to the fort, give us whatever you've got, and marched to St. Peter. And and then he discovered that the Indians had circled around and gone up near Hutchinson and farther north, and he was afraid the prize was Fort Ridgely, of course, which was a U.S. fort, and with a small garrison. It had just been reduced by a group had come down from Fort Ripley up north, and was on its way back to Fort Ripley when the thing broke loose, and they were able to reach them, send a scout after them and say, come on back, and he came back. I've forgotten the guy's name, but he was in charge during the siege of Fort Ridgely. Mm-hmm. And Ripley and Ridgely is enough to get most people confused to start with. But and Sibley, meanwhile, was being cursed up one way and down the other by the St. Paul papers, and Minneapolis particularly, which was a Republican town, and he'd been the Democratic governor. I mean, they didn't like Sibley, and he had, because he was so slow. And one of the interesting little tidbits is that Donnelly was the lieutenant governor, and Ramsey was out of the state trying to shake down Washington for some help. He sent Donnelly out to St. Peter to say why Sibley wasn't moving ahead. And Donnelly wrote back saying, it's a wonder he's moving at all, given the troops he hasn't got. So in any case, he did get to Fort Ridgely, and a group defied his orders and rode out ahead and got to Fort Ridgely and claimed they had liberated Fort Ridgely. But, you know, you can argue it one way or the other. And then from Fort Ridgely, there wasn't much to do, set out and bury the victims. And the Indians, he didn't know where they were because he didn't have many horses, and he couldn't send scouts out. And he had even fewer horses after Birch Coulee. And there again, Joe Brown, you do wonder what was going through Brown's head, because he agreed to that very, very vulnerable camping spot. And who knows? I mean, I don't think Brown was, you know, working for the Indians or anything, but he was just off in the ozone somewhere.
Yeah. But
he was not a military man, and Sibley probably would have been maybe smarter, who knows, but somebody with a little more training anyway.
They eventually, how did he respond? You know, went out, and eventually there was a battle decisive in favor of the
at Wood Lake, there was a battle, and again, Sibley was blamed for moving so slowly, and well, he didn't have any horses, and he didn't want to walk into a trap, and pretty much through luck, he didn't, and beat the Dakota. And then Little Crow and his warriors, the ones who were mobile and able to get away, took off for the Northwest and fled to Canada, basically. And Sibley, the rest surrendered. And at that point, of course, St. Paul and city folk were howling for Indian heads, and it would have been all too easy for somebody like the guy down in Kansas that massacred a whole village of Indians. Is you know, famous, infamous name. But you know, Sibley managed to surrender without any casualties, and that was pretty good. I mean, people who were yowling for Indian scalps apparently didn't mind losing a few white scalps too. In any case, I'm a Quaker.
Yeah, yeah. But he, after the war, he had another expedition in pursuit.
He was made a brigadier general by Lincoln. And this, I think, must have been the proudest moment of his life. I don't, somehow, it's just, he always went with the title general after that. And the whole war experience must have moved him very deeply in one way, whether it was the casualties or civilian casualties, many of them, or maybe he'd always wanted, felt a little inferior because he wasn't an army officer, I don't know. But, and of course he had never tried to, in 1860, as the Civil War was starting, Minnesota's first reaction was, oh, we'll, take care of the South pretty easily. And guess again. And he was competing, he was not competing with a whole bunch of Minnesota politicians who were trying to become colonels of a regiment. What's his name, Marshall?
McLeod, or?
Not
No.
McLeod, he wasn't military, but he became Governor Marshall, and Marshall Avenue was named for him. And he was one of them, but he was only one of many who became colonels of Minnesota regiments. And Sibley never tried to. And Ramsey probably was governor, and he probably would have appointed Sibley if Sibley'd asked for it, but he never did.
Sibley had you'd mentioned the convicting the 308. Could you talk a little bit
300
about,
odd.
Could you talk just a little bit about his role at Mankato?
Oh, well, by then the trials, the finish up of the trials was held at Redwood Falls, what's now Redwood Falls. It was called the lower agency then. And Sibley immediately returned to St. Paul because he had been appointed commander of the entire Minnesota district. And it was much easier to do that from St. Paul because of communication and so on than you couldn't do it from Redwood Falls. And so he left as soon as the trials were over. And he sent, I have been trying, and I forgot to look it up, the name of the officer that he left in charge, who again, Walt Bachman has done some research on this. And he was confronted with what appears from this distance to have been a real conspiracy to murder all those Indians. He prevented it, and they were legitimately hanged. Big difference to the Indians, but it does make the record a little better. And Sibley was not there. He did not go out to Mankato for the execution. Presumably his responsibilities in the Twin Cities were too heavy, and I don't know. There's nothing, he left nothing in writing that indicates that he didn't want to be there, or that he felt, as some claim, that he had a son being hanged or something like that. Mm-hmm. Nothing to hint that at all.
Well, he said he was busy in St. Paul, and maybe we could. What was Sibley's role with the Historical Society?
Oh, yeah, he helped create it, of course. Yeah, but Ramsey had an equally important role in that. Ramsey, of course, is the source of the famous quotation, "Newspapers, we say them, they're the daybooks of history." And of course, a daybook in those days meant something to people. Now,
Wow, you wrote this whole book on Sibley, but can you tell me the story of Henry Sibley and how would you summarize
I'd say go read the book. I have said that to several people who I felt really, I mean, you've read it clearly, and but people come and ask me questions, obvious questions about him. Why are you asking me? Just go read the book.
Well, we're doing this for I think an audience that
Well,
hopefully
school
will
kids,
be inspired to read the book. But in the meantime, if they are watching YouTube, which is probably going to be their first possibly first introduction.
Well, that's why the encyclopedia is up there. The Minipedia.
Yeah.
So that you can read something short and get the gist of who this guy was. But I have learned better than to say he was the state's first governor. That just sounds deadly. And it's very hard to summarize because he was so many different things, through so many different periods of time. I mean, he was here before, well, not before the white man was, but, pretty early, before there were any white settlers. It was Indian country. And he was here until 1891 when he died. And by then, we were the breadbasket of the world.
And Sibley was influential at
many points, right. Yep.
How would you summarize his contribution overall?
Oh gosh.
Is that asking too much?
Well, at the risk of sounding prejudiced in his favor, I'll say I think Minnesota was fortunate in having him. I think he was certainly not an angel or a paragon of virtue, and he would have been the first to admit that and say he was sorry. But he was, as politicians go, he was a very, very honest one. He believed in what he believed in, and that was basically the teachings of the Bible. And he put them into practice, as I mentioned, the whistleblowing incident, which was not popular, and he also set, as I said in the article, he set back railroad building in Minnesota by almost a decade by calling attention to the fraudulence that had gone into that. I wish we had Sibley here today.
A man of principle, you would say.
Yes, right.
And I think another point you say, nothing, the rule of law was a bedrock principle for him.
Yeah, absolutely. He really believed in the law. And it's ironic that he refused to become a lawyer until middle age when he had to, but he did have a very strong feeling for the law.